Okay, so you want to own a shipping port, stand above a field of cranes, watch container ships slide into your harbor, and collect money every time a vessel docks, a box moves, a truck enters, or a company rents space beside the water. The coastline is limited, the infrastructure is enormous. Nobody can build a competing port next door by Friday. It looks like the closest thing global trade has to a permanent toll gate, and in the right place, it can be an extraordinary business. But there is a terminal in southern Italy that shows why the picture is incomplete. Gioia Tauro sits beside major Mediterranean shipping routes. It has deep water, long berths, and cranes built to handle the largest container vessels. From the air, it looks like a piece of infrastructure the world would have no choice but to use. At one point, the company operating its main container terminal had one customer. A terminal moving millions of container units, hundreds of workers tied to the operation, one shipping company sitting underneath the traffic. That is the problem hiding inside port ownership. You can spend years building something that cannot move, then discover that the customer supplying the business can change a route on a map. Before we get to what happened next, you need to know what you would actually own, because the harbor, the land, the cranes, and the revenue may belong to different parties. In the common landlord port model, a public authority owns the land and major basic infrastructure. It controls the larger port estate, maintains shared systems, and leases parts of the site to private companies. A private terminal operator may then finance the cranes, hire the workers, run the container yard, and sign contracts with shipping lines. So when someone says investors bought a port, they may have bought shares in an operator, they may have acquired a long lease, they may have won a concession giving them the right to run one terminal and collect certain fees for a fixed number of years. The Port of Melbourne is a useful example. Its private operator controls the port under a 50-year lease. That can still be enormously valuable. 50 years is long enough to finance major projects and collect decades of income. But it is still a lease. The agreement can determine what the operator may charge, what it must maintain, what it must build, and what condition the asset must be in when the term ends. Two terminals can have the same cranes, the same water depth, and the same customers, but the one with far more years remaining on its concession may be worth much more. You are not only buying infrastructure, you are buying infrastructure with a clock attached. That is why there is no honest universal price for a port. One transaction may include valuable land and decades of operating rights. Another may include equipment that needs replacing, heavy debt, required construction, and a concession that is already well into its term. The purchase price only makes sense after you know which revenues transfer, which public functions stay outside your control, and how much money the contract requires you to put back into the site. A cheap terminal can be cheap because the traffic is weak. It can also be cheap because the buyer is inheriting years of expensive work. Now suppose you do not buy an existing terminal. You decide to build one. The first thing you need is not a crane. It is usable coastline. The approach channel has to be deep enough for the ships you expect. The quay wall has to support the land beside deep water. Behind it, you need an enormous paved yard, gate systems, inspection areas, power, roads, rail, and enough room to keep containers moving without turning the property into a steel traffic jam. Sometimes the land does not exist yet. Singapore's Tuas port shows the extreme version. When completed, it is planned to have roughly 66 berths, about 26 kilometers of quay, and eventual capacity of approximately 65 million 20-foot equivalent units. The development has been described at around 20 billion Singapore dollars. That is not a normal private purchase. It is a national-scale project, but it shows what port capacity really consists of: reclaimed land, dredged water, concrete, electricity, roads, rail, software, and years of spending before the finished system reaches the volume it was built to handle. And all of that creates capacity. It does not create a customer. A berth proves that a ship can stop there. A shipping line still has to decide that it should. That decision is where the money begins. Follow one ship into port. The vessel enters the harbor and reaches the berth. Giant cranes lift containers from the deck. Yard equipment carries those containers into stacks. Some boxes leave by truck. Some move onto trains. Some remain long enough to generate storage charges. Refrigerated containers need electricity and monitoring. Other boxes wait for another ship. At the same time, companies may be paying rent for terminal land, warehouses, offices, repair facilities, or industrial sites nearby. The box itself can create several kinds of income. The terminal may be paid to unload it, move it through the yard, connect it to electricity if it is refrigerated, inspect it, or store it after the free period ends. But even here, more revenue does not always mean a healthier operation. A container sitting in the yard can produce a storage charge. Too many containers sitting too long can clog the space needed for the next ship. The same object can be income and a warning. And not every payment goes to the same owner. The harbor authority, terminal operator, rail company, warehouse landlord, and trucking company may all earn from one container's journey without any one of them controlling the whole journey. This creates two businesses inside the same port. The landlord earns from the place. The terminal operator earns from the movement. A port authority such as Rotterdam can collect rental income from companies occupying valuable land and port dues connected to use of the harbor. A container terminal operator is more directly exposed to handling volume. More boxes usually mean more operating revenue. Fewer boxes can mean less. In 2025, total cargo throughput at Rotterdam declined slightly to roughly 428 million tons. Yet the port authority's revenue rose to about 940 million euros, while net profit was around 266 million euros. The cargo moved one way. The owner's reported revenue moved another. That can happen because the landlord side is not paid only for lifting boxes. It has leases, dues, and a broader industrial estate. A terminal operator can have a very different year inside the same harbor. This is why a crowded port does not tell you who is doing well. Now return to Gioia Tauro. Its strength was transshipment. A large vessel could arrive from one part of the world, unload containers, and let smaller feeder ships carry those boxes toward other ports. The container might never leave through a truck gate. It might never enter a nearby warehouse. The terminal was serving the shipping network itself. That model can create enormous activity. It can also make the carrier designing the network unusually powerful. In 2017, the company operating the main container terminal reported that MSC was its only customer. The same report described the transfer of 377 employees to a state agency and a slight annual loss of about 600,000 euros. Put those facts beside the aerial image. Rows of cranes, millions of container movements, hundreds of workers affected. One customer, the terminal, was physically large and commercially narrow. That worker transfer is not just an employment footnote. It shows how a route decision can move through the whole operation. Less traffic means less work to spread across the equipment and workforce. A commercial relationship negotiated far from the terminal can change what happens to people whose jobs are tied to one fixed place. The route map looks abstract. The consequences arrive at the gate. Now, one large customer is not automatically a bad arrangement. A major carrier can provide consistent volume, coordinate vessel calls, support investment, and make a terminal central to its regional system. But the customer knows what it supplies. If most of the terminal's activity comes from one carrier, the operator cannot negotiate as though that traffic has nowhere else to go. The carrier can compare costs, berth availability, feeder connections, service reliability, and capacity across several ports. The port may be scarce on its own coastline. The customer is choosing inside a much larger network, and this is where the number most people use to judge a port becomes less reassuring than it looks. Ports commonly report container activity in 20-foot equivalent units. One standard 20-foot container represents 1 unit. A 40-foot container commonly represents 2. Now watch one physical box. A large ship arrives at a transshipment terminal. The box is unloaded. That movement enters the throughput count. Later, a feeder vessel arrives. The same box is loaded onto that second ship. That movement enters the count again. 1 box, 2 handling movements. The count is legitimate. The terminal did the work twice and may earn revenue from both moves. But the headline total does not mean the same number of unique containers entered the surrounding economy. The box may never touch a truck or train. Its reason for being there may exist entirely inside the shipping line's current route plan. Container count can also move differently from cargo weight. Empty boxes still count as units. Rotterdam has reported periods when container unit growth and container tonnage did not move together, with empty container imbalances contributing to the difference. So throughput proves that the terminal was active. It does not tell you what rate the operator earned. It does not tell you how many customers created the volume. And it does not tell you how difficult that traffic would be to move somewhere else. At Gioia Tauro, that last question became real. During the first half of 2018, the terminal's handling volume fell by approximately 8%, from about 1,256,000 20-foot equivalent units to about 1,156,000. The company attributed the decline to changes in MSC's such scheduled service network and to strike action. It also reported a slightly negative result for the period. The cranes were still there. The water was still deep. The terminal could still do the work, but fewer boxes arrived for it to do. That is the structural risk at the center of port ownership. The owner commits capital to one point on the map. The carrier organizes ships across the entire map. A shipping line cannot move every service without cost. It has customers, connections, federations, and capacity limits of its own. Ports are not perfectly interchangeable, but some cargo is far more movable than the physical asset makes it appear. And once the volume leaves, the cost does not leave at the same speed. A modern container terminal has to remain ready. The channel has to remain usable. Cranes need maintenance. Gate systems, security, and the information systems connecting the terminal with carriers, customs, truckers, and rail operators still have to function. The concession payment does not pause. The financing still has to be serviced. Required investment does not disappear because one service was reduced. Some operating costs fall with activity. Fewer moves can reduce certain labor hours, fuel use, and equipment wear. The problem is the amount of the business that has to be ready before the next ship appears. Security cannot open only when the yard is full. A refrigerated container cannot lose power because traffic is weak. A vessel arriving on schedule cannot wait while the operator rebuilds a maintenance team that was dismissed during the slow month. Reliability is part of what the customer is buying, and reliability has to exist before the customer uses it. But you cannot shrink the quay wall. You cannot return part of the channel. You cannot stop the concession clock until the customer comes back. Picture the terminal after a major service is reduced. There is more open pavement between the stacks. One berth waits longer for a ship. The operator can reduce some activity, but it is still maintaining a facility designed for a busier network. When volume is strong, scale spreads the cost. When volume falls, scale becomes weight. And in April of 2019, Gioia reported that it sold its indirect 50% interest in the terminal. That sale does not prove one single cause. The available facts do not allow you to say the service change alone forced the transaction or that the slight losses told the whole story, but the sequence matters. One customer, workers transferred, volume down, a stake sold. This is what customer concentration looks like when it moves beyond a spreadsheet. Now the story turns. Because Gioia Tauro did not become irrelevant, the terminal's traffic later recovered strongly. Official port figures show roughly 3,380,000 20-foot equivalent units in 2022, about 3,549,000 in 2023, roughly 3,940,000 in 2024, roughly 3,940,000 in 2024, and around 4,500,000 in 2025. The same physical asset that had revealed its vulnerability later reached record activity. That reversal matters because it rules out the easiest explanation. The terminal was not simply in the wrong sea with the wrong equipment. The asset could still perform at enormous scale when the commercial and operating conditions around it supported that use. It would be misleading to credit one change for all of that. The available facts do not prove that ownership alignment alone caused the rebound. Investment, labor arrangements, terminal performance, market conditions, and shipping service decisions can all affect the result. But the recovery proves something important. The port was not doomed by its concrete. Its value changed when its place inside the shipping network changed. That is why two containers sitting beside each other in the same yard can mean very different things to an owner. The first arrived on one ship and will leave on another. It is using the terminal as a transfer point. Its route may change if the carrier reorganizes the network. The second is placed on a train. It is heading toward factories, warehouses, retailers, or consumers connected to this particular gateway. Sending it through another port may add inland distance, time, congestion, or cost. Both boxes create throughput. Only one may have a strong reason to cross this exact piece of land. This is the difference between transshipment cargo and gateway cargo. Transshipment can still be an excellent business. It can create enormous scale and keep expensive cranes working intensively. Gateway cargo can still be lost if service is poor, congestion becomes severe, or inland connections fail. The point is not that one category is always good and the other is always bad. The point is that the owner has to know what makes the cargo stay. A strong port usually builds several answers at once. Nearby consumers create import demand. Local industries create exports. Rail and road links make the port cheaper to use. Warehouses and logistics parks give companies a reason to remain close. Multiple carriers reduce dependence on one relationship. Long customer commitments can support expensive investment. Reliable operations make switching less attractive. None of these replaces deep water or cranes. They make the physical asset harder to bypass. This is why the landlord model can be so powerful when it is attached to a broad industrial and logistics space. The owner may receive rent from land, warehouses, and industrial sites while also collecting port dues. A slower cargo category does not necessarily remove every source of income at once. It also explains why Rotterdam can report higher port authority revenue during a year when total cargo throughput falls slightly. The port is not one bet on one handling stream. It is a collection of land, infrastructure, tenants, cargo types, and connections. Gioia Tauro shows the concentrated version. Rotterdam shows the diversified version. Neither is automatically safe. Rotterdam still has to invest, maintain infrastructure, and respond to trade and energy changes. Gioia Tauro's transshipment focus can still produce extraordinary scale, but they reveal two very different ways of owning a port. Now imagine the strong ownership scenario. You acquire a long concession or a stake in a port company. The traffic forecast assumes realistic demand, not the largest number anyone can fit into a presentation. The port serves a large local market, important industries, or both. It has road and rail connections that move cargo inland without turning the gate into a permanent bottleneck. Several carriers use the terminal, or one major customer has made commitments strong enough to justify the investment built around it. Income comes from more than one layer: land, port dues where the structure allows them, handling, storage, refrigerated container services, rail activity, warehouses, and logistics property. Then a weak year arrives. One service is reduced, handling revenue falls. A carrier moves some transshipment activity elsewhere, but factories still need their imports, exporters still need the rail connection, tenants still occupy logistics land, and other customers continue using the terminal. The port has a bad year without allowing one schedule change to become the whole year. That is what resilience looks like in this business. Not an asset that never loses traffic. An asset with enough independent reasons for traffic to remain. Now imagine the weak version. The purchase price assumes rapid volume growth. Most of the traffic comes from one carrier or alliance. A large share of the headline throughput is transshipment activity that can be reorganized through another hub. The terminal has impressive capacity but weak inland connections. The concession requires continued spending. The debt was sized for a traffic level that has not been secured. Then the major customer asks for lower rates, better service, or new investment. Perhaps it wants a deeper berth, newer equipment, more yard space, or a commercial arrangement that lowers its cost. The operator knows the request could require years of spending. It also knows the customer supplies most of the volume used to justify that spending. The owner has two bad choices: refuse, and the carrier may move some volume; agree, and the ships may stay while the owner's return gets weaker. If traffic falls, the debt and concession obligations remain. If the owner borrows again to protect the customer relationship, even more capital becomes tied to the same source of demand. That is how a port can remain visibly busy while becoming financially disappointing. The cranes move. The annual report shows millions of units. But the rates, the obligations, the debt, and the customer concentration decide how much value is left. And the spending does not stop after the port opens. Ships become larger. Security and data systems need upgrading. Ports may need shore power, electrified handling equipment, stronger cybersecurity, or infrastructure for alternative fuels. The owner may need to invest before the customer fully commits, because the customer wants proof the terminal will be ready. Build too late and the service may go elsewhere. Build too early, and the owner may finance another expensive piece of capacity that demand never fills. This is the final tension inside the business. A port has to prepare for traffic before the traffic is guaranteed. So, does owning a shipping port work? Yes, but the attractive version is far more specific than the fantasy. It works when the ownership rights last long enough, the debt can survive a weak year, the income comes from several sources, and the cargo has more than one reason to use that location. It works when the port is connected to a market, an industrial base, and an inland network that a carrier cannot replace by changing one line on a route map. It becomes dangerous when permanent capital depends on temporary loyalty. At the beginning, you pictured yourself owning the doorway every ship had to pass through. What you may really own is a concession with a clock on it, a terminal built for customers you do not control, and a place whose value depends on how difficult it is for the cargo to leave. The harbor is the visible asset. The reason to keep using it is the business.